Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're really fortunate to have Emily Yang. She is professor of geography at the University of Colorado Boulder and a past president of the American Association of Geographers. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm really glad we're able to make this work. As I've discussed with nearly everyone who has been interviewed, I'm going to ask you first to reflect upon your childhood and maybe where you were raised, maybe some episodes in your childhood, and note if there were any catalysts that might have struck you to pursue geography, but then go on to your undergraduate studies and your graduate studies as well. Would you care to share?
Sure. I have probably a less direct or more circuitous route to geography than many, although I know many of us don't come straight into it. There's not much in my childhood that I can think of that would have led in a straight line to geography. I was born in Buffalo, New York. My father was a physics professor who did not get tenure. We then moved when I was very young to Tennessee, where he was at the Oak Ridge National Labs. Then we moved to Illinois and then to New Jersey. And my parents were both with Bell Labs and then AT&T then. I came from a family of, immigrants on both sides. My parents were born in China, raised in Taiwan, came to the U.S. for college and for higher ed, for a graduate degree in the case of my father. My parents' generation were all physicists and engineers of various kinds. So I grew up very much on the science and engineering track as well. I will say that the next generation, my generation of, the children of all those engineers and physicists have all gone on to do other things. I have a cousin who's a political scientist as well. So maybe it was just kind of trying to do something different from what was the path that was laid out to me. I did travel to Taiwan a few times as a kid because my grandparents at my mom's side still live there. And I think, travel is something that really attracts many people to geography, especially on the human side. And that's something, that maybe was a little bit of a spark. I traveled, in college as well. In college, I went to MIT and I studied electrical engineering because I had an uncle who taught at MIT and I had a cousin who went to MIT. And so I kind of did the thing that everyone was expecting. And I went there. I studied electrical engineering. I realized halfway through some summer internships that I really, while I didn't mind the coursework, I didn't think I enjoyed doing the work in a cubicle. And I wanted to do something that was more socially engaged. I think MIT has a certain kind of reputation, but I became much more sort of politically aware, while I was there, like many others, involved in LGBTQ rights and abortion rights. It seems we've come in a circle since that time. Environmental issues, and so I knew I wanted to do something that seemed more socially relevant than the problem sets that I was studying. So when I finished I went ahead and finished my degree. My parents sent me to China when I finished my undergrad, somewhat against my will. So I went to China. I studied Chinese in Beijing.
Where were you?
In Beijing. In Beijing.
Yeah, it was a summer program. I had just finished, 4 years of undergrad. So I kind of was done with doing classes. So I met some
I met a few tourists and we decided to go to Xinjiang. And I was just like, I'll go wherever. I do not want to be in this classroom anymore. At that time, there were floods in Xinjiang. We couldn't go. And so they said, let's go to Tibet. And this was during the, kind of early 90s. There was a lot of growing interest in Tibet, but I actually was completely unaware of all that. And I just thought, that sounds like a good idea. And it happened to be during this brief window of time when you didn't have to get a permit as a foreigner. We just bought tickets, we went. And I was just really awestruck by the cultural landscape, by the physical landscape. It was, just very, very different from anything I had ever seen. And it just really fascinated me. And I knew I wanted to go back. So that's kind of the seeds of how I got started doing, what I've been doing since then. I enrolled in a master's program that was called the Technology and Policy Program, and also at MIT. And it was, I describe it as a program for ex-engineers and physicists who really want to do something more socially relevant and have no idea how. So it was a very kind of, it was a program that really let you explore. So I took classes at the Kennedy School. I studied Chinese. I took a class in the Department of Urban Studies at the time with Jesse Rabeau, who is a geographer. And it was on the political economy of development in the third world. It was called something like that. And that just kind of blew my mind. Like I'd done a fair amount of like humanities and writing and other kinds of social sciences, but nothing like that. And I kind of wanted to do what he did, which was to, he had done field work in Senegal, I believe. So I found out that he had gone to the Energy and Resources group at Berkeley, and I decided I would do that as well. I did also do an internship after I finished that master's. So MIT had a program that sent students to China. And I spent a year as an intern at what was called China Center for Agenda 21. So this was shortly after the Rio conference. China had set up an office for sustainable development. And I interned for them. I think I was called like a program officer or something, but I was kind of a glorified translator. But I got to see lots of project documents, and I lived in China for a year. That was the first time I'd lived there for an extended period of time. I got to visit Tibet a few more times. And then from there, I went to the Energy and Resources group at Berkeley. And that's a sort of interdisciplinary group that's taken on different characters over the years, but there have been a number of geographers who have come out of there. Scott Prudhomme, Matthew Turner, Jesse Rabeau, Asher Gertner, among others. So very interdisciplinary, took a lot of geography classes.
And there are geography faculty that are affiliated with that group as well.
Yeah, the structure of it has changed now. There's been some reorg since I was there, but at that time it was a funny program where it wasn't under any college. It was a standalone group. It had been formed in the 70s out of the energy crisis. There were 5 core faculty, but something like 70 affiliates, and and you could have an affiliate as an advisor. Nancy Peluso was affiliated with that. She was in ESPM, Environmental Science Policy and Management, although, lots of overlap with geography as well. And so she was my main advisor. So, yeah. So that's, a little bit of a nutshell of kind of how I came to.
Well, comment on, if you don't mind, elaborate a little bit on this doctoral setting, which is quite unlike typical autonomous departments, or at least when you went, it wasn't like that. And you had a couple of geographers on your committee, I guess, to guide you in your research. Would you care to comment on that experience as well?
Yeah, I think it was a program of of varying interests, but a lot of interests in partly it was a very activist oriented kind of scholar activism. There were a lot of super really talented and driven students from a variety of different perspectives, people working on the ecology, people working on the energy side. I think it's tilted more back towards energy. When I was then, it was very, it was very like the students were very active. And like all the programs that are like the technology and policy program I was at before, there were not a lot of core classes, and it was a lot of like, go figure out what, you want to do. We're not going to give you so much structure, but you have the freedom to take classes. So, I took classes with Michael Watts and Jillian Hart my very first year, and that was very influential in my thinking. And that.
Would you care to elaborate on their influence?
Yeah, so it was, Jillian Hart's development class, and of course she's very well known for her work on development, her her kind of theorization of little d and big D development, which she was really just kind of working out at that time. That was shortly before she wrote Disabling Globalization. I think she was like working out the ideas of that. And so, she really brought that to her classes. And a lot of my dissertation ended up, being about development and so forth. And certainly I took Michael Watts's agrarian studies class, or, the peasant class, as people refer to it. I think that introduced me to I had taken the class at MIT with Jesse Rabeau, but that was like the first time I had any exposure. And so it kind of sunk in a little bit more, thinking about agrarian change and a Marxian political economy approach, and they're just such big figures in the stuff that I am.
They're giants.
You
were very fortunate to have such stellar geographers really guide you.
Yeah. So, and I also, again, Nancy Peluso, not technically in a geography department, but very active and influential as well. And I was able to take a class on political ecology with her as well.
Mm-hmm. And so would you please elaborate a bit really on your dissertation with regard to what your major findings were? Because this is really a life's work for you that's ongoing.
Yeah. Sure. I guess I can, I can step back and say my first project was not what ended up being my dissertation. And in hindsight, I could have made it a dissertation, but I didn't have the sort of foresight to see that at the time. So I was interested in doing something in China because I spoke Chinese. I was also very interested in Tibet just from having been there as a tourist, actually by that point 3 times, really kind of had fallen in love with the language and the culture. There was, in terms of doing field work, you always need some sort of entry right into the field. There were a number of Tibetans living in Berkeley in the Bay Area. It's one of the biggest population centers for Tibetans in the United States. And I had met some people who told me about their families in Yunnan province, which is sort of the southeastern corner of the Tibetan Plateau, who were involved in matsutake mushroom harvesting, and they told me about some forest conflicts that were happening. So I my first summer after my first year, I went and I met people through their families and did a little bit of a study on conflicts over access to the matsutake mushrooms, which had become, they've always grown there, and they became a very important livelihood resources with Japanese search for new sources after the decline of Japanese forests. Anyway, so I started working with the commodity chain and how the commodity chain was affecting local property rights, like causing a definition of property rights, and then looking at how they were resolved. So I say that all to say that, like, I remember at that time, not knowing about geography as a discipline and not really knowing how to place myself. And I had gotten an SSRC pre-dissertation fellowship, and I went to a fellowship and nobody knew kind of what to place me as. And they would call me like the mushroom lady, or the one doing mushrooms. And so it just
the
felt
one
really
doing mushrooms in Berkeley.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and I didn't really know how to, so I wrote a paper about the property rights aspect, which is, standard, very politically, ecologically focused. And then I set that aside and I was like, oh, that can't be a dissertation project. I need to find something else. But, 20 years later, Anna Tsing writes, the mushroom at the end of the world. She has this whole Matsutake Worlds group. And now Michael Hathaway has written a book on what a mushroom lives for from a multi-species perspective. So I guess that's to say that, like, for grad students, rather than following the latest trend, I think it is a good idea to follow what seems interesting. And there probably is a way of theorizing it and making it an interesting topic. And I just didn't realize that at the time.
I don't know. Would you have wanted to have been known as the mushroom lady in the geographical community?
I mean, I think, who knows? Maybe it wouldn't have been so bad. Anyway, so for my dissertation, it did really take me a while to figure out what I wanted to do. I had trouble defining my topic, and what led me to it was I took a year to study Tibetan language in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet Autonomous Region. And what I noticed at the time was, vegetables were all being grown by Chinese migrants. And this was the case and so it was like helping to bring in migrants, even as Tibetans were also very clearly unhappy about the extent of migration. So I was sort of interested in that puzzle, like what compels people to do things, even as they also don't like the effects of kind of what they're doing. And then when I asked people, like, why rent out your land? They would say, oh, we're too lazy to do this kind of work, right? And clearly they're not lazy there any more than anyone else. And it was sort of like trying to tease apart, like, to what extent is this a reflection of state discourse about why Tibetans are so-called underdeveloped or backwards, and to what extent is it, their own sort of distinction making of themselves from other people. So that was the puzzle that kind of drove my dissertation research, which ended up, becoming a bigger project. But again, I just thinking about a student audience, I mean, I think there's different ways of going about finding topics. Like, one way is to be very invested in a particular theoretical area or a question and find a place or a situation that's appropriate to study it. I'm doing that more now, but for a long time I tend to do projects more where there's something that's puzzling. There's some sort of, conundrum, and I that's what motivates me to do that. So that was sort of the sort of, seed into it. And I don't end up answering that question in a simple, like, why do they do this? Because of course it's completely overdetermined. And so it's sort of like following that outwards into all the different factors that, like, create a situation where people end up renting out their land. So, and then that becomes part of a broader story about development as a form of state territorialization in Tibet, which I trace through three periods. One in the 1950s with the advent of, like, state farms and modern agriculture, and the way in which Tibetan former landless people were incorporated and brought into this project of enabling the Chinese state to set its roots there. And then in the 90s with, the ways in which migration kind of opened up, the early seeds and through which some Sichuan migrants came to Tibet and started to see this opportunity for vegetable farming, the property rights, the social relations, the cultural ideas of relating to each other over economic activities, and how that sort of enabled the migrants to kind of gain this foothold. And then into the 2000s, where urbanization and a massive wave of house building was really kind of the newest development initiative. And again, the way in which people were sort of taking on loans that were bigger than what they really felt comfortable with in order to satisfy a state project to build houses. And so I see these all as like specific moments in which development kind of transforms the landscape, and Tibetans are enrolled in that project. Understanding the entanglements that it gets them in, but then still feeling pressured to take part in that project, which then incorporates them more into the Chinese state. So that's kind of like I wrote a book about 10 years ago, and that's kind of what that was about.
But you were able to illustrate the complexities of this particular phenomenon, and it's messy.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's not easy to understand without addressing a number of these issues. And today you're addressing global climate change, are you not?
Yeah. So I can, I have, been interested in and done some different aspects of climate change. One aspect grows out of another stream of my work, which has really been on pastoralism, on a nomadic, previously nomadic areas, which are both, vulnerable to climate change, but some of what I've looked at, like many other geographers, is how, of course, climate change never happens by itself, right? It's always articulating with a specific set of policy and political economic factors. And so we've looked at how state policies that have been implemented in the name of both development and environmental protection have decreased mobility, increased transaction costs for mobility, and really made people more vulnerable to snowstorms, which are one of the main manifestations of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. Also looked at kind of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge of, how people interpret, basically how do they interpret the weather through what's happening with the plants, and using that as a case where we see some contradictions in like their own observations of like when green up is happening versus where the snow line is, and some contradictions within different remote sensing data sets, some contradictions between local knowledge and the few observations, weather data that exists, and sort of using it as a case to say, we can actually bring places where there are contradictions between knowledge systems are actually a way of looking for generation of new knowledge. So a lot of the studies of the effects of climate change on phenology have been done in like the US West. And of course, the climate system is very different in Tibet. And so, we're looking at why green up actually seems to be later rather than earlier with climate change. Another aspect is which I've been thinking more and more in terms of climate justice, where in the name of adaptation, a lot of herders have been resettled. And so I've worked in some interdisciplinary teams with ecologists who have done some experiments showing that, resettling people, removing grazing entirely is not actually adaptive for ecosystems that are that have evolved with grazers. And then, of course, the social effects are quite devastating. More recently, I've been doing some work I did some work at the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC and thinking about kind of China's position in, how it's negotiating positions are both, have pushed loss and damage forward. And so you could say that that's a form of climate justice on one scale, but how that national scale focus that COP is, stuck with really elides other forms of injustice at regional scales, and for small island developing states and small island states and the least developed countries. So yeah, those are some of the climate issues that I've been interested in.
Well, and while you were president of the AAG, you were concerned about the impact that the annual conferences would have on climate change as well. Would you care to comment on that and how this was addressed?
Yeah, so this is an ongoing issue. So this started with a member. Well, it started a long time ago. I mean, my understanding is that council has long, during different periods of time, been quite concerned about climate change and reducing climate impacts. In the COVID years are all blurring together. I think it was around 2020. There was a member petition. No, it must have been before that. 2019, there was a member petition that was led by Pam Martin and Joan Evans that called on the AAG to reduce its emissions related to the annual meeting by commensurate with IPCC recommendations, basically. And at the time, council, I was not on council yet, but council voted and put together a task force, and Wendy Jepson was the chair of the task force. So when I came on, it was almost a year into the task force's work. And, as president, you pick a few topics that you want to work on. So I got quite involved in trying to move that forward. I mean, in a way, I think the coincidence of that with COVID, it had both positive and negative, kind of results. On the one hand, it kind of fast tracked some of the things, if you will, that the task force wanted to do. I think the fact that the task force had been thinking about virtual also maybe helped AAG a little bit in terms of moving to the virtual. So, it was a kind of an experiment in the fact that virtual conferencing is possible. On the other hand, I think 3 years of virtual and certainly the last 2 years were really staff decisions. I think my understanding from Gary is that the staff did not feel comfortable because of various waves that were happening. I mean, I do think, it has led to this thing where people everywhere, including geographers, are just really tired of virtual conferencing, having had that experiment. So there's almost like a bit of a backlash to that. A couple of the ideas that we had when I went around to the regions, I certainly heard very clearly that many of the regions were pretty unhappy with the R1s for not going to regional conferences, and one thing I thought we could do that, I understand why we haven't, is to really emphasize the regional conferences and to almost maybe even make the regional conferences the national conference one year and see how that went. There was a Regions Connect experiment 2021, I think, where they tried to connect a number of the regional meetings and have those simultaneously. It was during the height of COVID. There were technical issues. I think, I think it was an interesting experiment, but for various financial reasons, AAG has not kind of proceeded with that. I think the other thing, that we have we really pushed is nodes. So this idea that you can, there's lots of reasons people may not want to go to a national meeting. Carbon is just one of them. We had a survey where a lot of people mentioned childcare issues, just other reasons why, like disability or other reasons why they can't travel. And so this year there were quite a few nodes. So I ran one in Boulder, and it was a lot of work, but I'm glad I did it. Like, I think that many of the student participants in particular said we wouldn't have gone to AAG otherwise, but we were able to, watch panels. We were able to do some Q&A. We had our own mini conference. So those are some of the ideas. There's a lot of work to be done, until we have like a good high-speed rail system in this country. It's not clear how we're going to really, solve this issue. There's hotel contracts that get in the way. A lot of the barriers are financial. At the end of the day.
They certainly are. And one of the realities is the annual meeting in the past was a significant revenue generator for the organization.
Yeah, I mean, when I started, I remember the numbers were something like 33% of the operating budget. The annual revenue came from the meetings, and another like 17% came from membership. And there was this, tie of membership to conferences. And so, part of, I think, what's been important but difficult is to try to have members just renew separately from the annual meeting and see some value added to supporting the association, even if one doesn't choose to go in person to an annual meeting at any particular. I've heard that, since I left council, it might be up to even 50% from the meeting. I don't know if that's, I'm not sure if that's due to like the COVID, the cancellations and all that stuff, but I know that that's something that Gary and Rebecca are very actively trying to look at. But it's a bigger problem for organizations like the AAG, right? It also makes money from Taylor and Francis, and of course, nobody likes, there was all these questions about the public publishing model, and then membership would like AG to invest in various kinds of activities. And so I do have a lot of sympathy for Gary of like, you don't like any of the things that make us money and you want to spend a bunch of money. So, what do you do? So it's definitely a
serious. And you mentioned in an interview on the Geography Books Network, I recall listening to this one that was done maybe last year or the year before, which is a pretty good interview, by the way. You commented on how a number of geographers are going away from the AAG and going into the American Geophysical Union, especially physical geographers. Do you still see that? I'm not as observant as you are, so.
I think I don't think it's about being observant. I think it's I do see that. I see that in my own department, very much so. There's very few. I think so Tom Veblen was one of my colleagues, very distinguished biogeographer. He retired years ago. He was of the generation that like went to the AG, but I think that, I think we have gotten to a point where, on the one hand, I will say that my own department has hired a lot of physical geographers who don't come from geography, right? Because I think that just the nature of what we call physical geography and its fluidity with, civil engineering or geology or geosciences has shifted over time. So I think for many of my colleagues, they don't have geography degrees, so they especially don't see the reason to go. But even the ones who do, Walid Abdullati and Mark Serez are all both very well known.
Absolutely.
And they both have geography degrees from my department. But the AGU is where they go. And I think it's, I think AGU pioneered a model of extremely cheap memberships and became this gigantic behemoth and has like 60,000 members. And so that as it just kind of has like sucked up all the room in the air for interdisciplinary physical sciences. And it's not just geography. I know I've colleagues say the same thing has happened to the geological science at the GSA, Ecological Society of America. Like they're all feeling this tension. So it's a real puzzle,
Well, we have our challenges set before us as geographers and as those who would like to see the AAG thrive in uncertain times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another issue is just, again, getting back to publications, the AG doesn't have that many journals. And I think AGU has I don't remember the number, but it's definitely more than 10 journals, right? And so there's a number of factors where at a particular moment in time, the AGU was able to kind of step in and attract a lot of, and so now it's even Marilyn Raphael, right? She goes to AGU. Of course, she goes to AAG too. She feels very like some of my colleagues, some of my younger colleagues too. They feel very dedicated to geography for its holistic, perspective, for its connections to humans and society. But they also feel like for the academic conversations they want to be in, they also have to go there, right? And I think Marilyn has said the same thing.
Well, and that is a reality. The AAG, the leadership in the AAG, meaning council, and geographers in general must contend with. How do we address these changes and these other venues or forums that can build our discipline, but externally to our discipline's main academic organization, As president, would you care to comment, president of the AAG, would you care to comment on some of the most significant challenges that you were compelled to face?
Yeah, so I had the full-on COVID experience
Right.
at David Kaplan and Amy as well, Amy Lobin. So I think the fact that so much was online, in a way, it was, I didn't travel as much as I think, some other ones. I did end up going to all of the regional meetings in person or online, but perhaps not as much as others. I think there were some financial challenges, but I think the bigger challenges have come after. I think the loss of revenue over COVID is really hitting hard now. What are some of the challenges? There were some confidential personnel stuff I can't talk about. That's I think one of the challenges is, I did spend a fair bit of time thinking about the physical geography, and really talking to people and trying to come up with something. And I don't know that, I made any headway. I think the same with the regions, like how do we make the regions stronger? How do we, and the regions are so, they're so varied, right? Some are very healthy and big, some are maybe too small, some don't really like the AG and think of themselves as separate. And so I think that's a challenge that I tried to wrap my head around and tried to make some progress on, and I don't know if I did or not. I think the challenge of trying to make some sort of real change in terms of carbon footprint, also a big one. I think more abstractly, I think when you're president, many people think you can make changes that you have no power to make, because there's a lot of not a lot of recognition of, like, you know, the executive director actually does most of the things, or you know, it's council, right? Most things have to go to a council vote.
And you're just one vote in council.
Yeah. So, you know, Amy Lobin said, she said it was kind of like being the queen. It's like no one sees you, but your actual decision making, you know, you actually can't do that much. So you do get a lot of, I got a lot of email. I think a lot of people had really good things to say, but they weren't things that I could actually make changes on. And then from the outside, it looks very, very slow, or it looks like you don't care, or like nothing is happening. So
well,
I think
you
that
invited people to email you. So
I did.
You got emails because, I mean, the members, such as myself, and emailed you when I know I heard you say, please email me if you have a concern. So
yeah. No, I did. And there were some things, I mean, I do feel like there are some things where, you know, getting those emails and then you can bring it to council, or you can bring it. Sometimes it really, you know, can lead to real change. So, I mean, one example is when there was a military and geography task force, and they had produced a report. And when I got on council, for various reasons, it had not made it to the agenda. And so it had been a year. And I know the people in charge of it were very unhappy and thought that AAG was just sort of like stonewalling. And it's more like things fall through the cracks. And so I was able to sort of, you know, make some action on that. So I mean, things like people would email me during the meeting and complain about their rooms. I was like, I really can't do anything about that, you know. So, but absolutely. I mean, I do think, you know, Gary's very open to hearing members, and I was very open. It was more like when I would get things about like the room or something like that I really had.
So can you get me an upgrade in Detroit as a past president? And what about the free beer tickets anyway that came with registration? Those are the important things.
Yeah, I think there's been some, and this was, I think it happened before I joined council. I mean, I think there's been some questions about the alcohol from the staff.
Look, as we're talking about leadership, let's talk about your role as a department chair. Would you care to discuss your role as a chair and how you perceive your leadership style as a chair in your department?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. One, I mean, there's the head model and then there's the chair model, and we're very chair model, and we're a pretty flat department in a pretty flat institution. So I guess, you know, I saw myself as like a servant leader kind of thing. Like my goal was really to help department members get done what they needed to get done to be successful. I mean, I saw a lot of my role and what I really enjoyed best, I think, was trying to champion geography within the institution, right? Like all geographers, we face the constant confusion with geology and geosciences, and like people not having any idea what geography is and always forgetting about geography. You know, like there was a proposal for a school of environment and sustainability, and they weren't going to include geography, like, you know. So really putting myself out there to you know, put together statistics and, you know, remind the administration about why geography is an important department, important discipline, is, I think, yeah, probably the most fulfilling aspect of the role for me. I think, you know, part of it was also, there's the usual hiring and trying to diversify, putting together proposals to allow us to bring in more diverse faculty. Yeah. What else should I say? I think some of our, one of the things we did that the university did that was helpful was to have something called they have these trainings in what they call crucial conversations, and I did the training, and I thought actually that was really helpful because sometimes as a chair you're sort of administration, but you're not really administration, and you're kind of in this awkward in-between position. And so I think that can lead to a lot of conflict avoidance. Not that conflict seeking is good, but that sometimes you need to have hard conversations with, just with various issues that arise. And so trying to address some of those, taking a more careful look at new sources of income that might be available was also something that I think was useful for the department. I was chair for 4 years, and then I went on sabbatical, and then the chair at the time really didn't want to be chair. And so I stepped in. I agreed to step in as interim for a year. That's how I did a 5th year. And I agreed before I knew COVID was coming. And so managing COVID was just terrible. But there was no great way to do it. But that's something I worked on as well, just like classroom spaces and who's going to teach, and is it unfair for the grad students in front of the classroom, and all those sorts of issues.
It's really like you say, it's sort of a transition role, or maybe it's a midwife of sorts between faculty and administration to facilitate the needs of the faculty and advocate for them, while also recognizing that at least some of the demands of administrative leadership are reasonable to have a functioning academic department.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just give one example of an unreasonable demand that I fought off successfully, at least for a while. So my university had for 30 years, our college had a geography requirement, basically a world regional. It was put in place, back in the 80s when people realized that.
I think Risa Palm was very instrumental in that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that seems right. And so I had a dean, 2 deans ago, we had a dean who heard anecdotally that students from California don't want to come to CU Boulder because they don't like that requirement. So he called me in and said, I want your department to propose to get rid of this requirement. I was like, no way, because it funds, it with these big 500 student classes, funded a lot of our lines. So I was able to I mean, it took a lot of work, but I was able to hold that off. Although last summer, the Colorado Committee on Higher Ed just eliminated that entire category of requirements anyway.
The sinners.
So anyway, that's a bit of an issue.
But it's persisted for 40 years.
Yeah. No, it's
so that's a partial success story. Emily, we have just a couple minutes to go here, and I'm going to ask you to think about the career you have had and where you're going, but to reflect upon these things and consider advice you might wish to share with students interested in geography, those perhaps crafting master's theses and doctoral dissertations, and colleagues perhaps in the field. Do you have any words of wisdom you'd like to share?
Geography is, it's broad, so it's hard to have advice that's, I guess, generic enough for all kinds of geography. So I feel like what I said earlier about topics, I do feel like there's a lot of we do see a lot of like trends of like everyone's working on this, everyone's working on that. And I feel like if you have something you're really passionate about, even if it's not the trend of the moment, it's worth pursuing. On the other hand, I also see, and I felt this myself as a student, like picking a topic was really, really difficult for me. And, if you're a student, what you're working on now need not be what you work on forever as well. I mean, although I've worked on Tibet for a long time, I've worked on very, very different topics. I've really, kind of had the freedom to follow my interests, follow the things that have happened. Yeah, what else? I feel like at least, in my experience at the undergrad level, the students who find us are really happy to find us. And it's really more, they don't find us until they're juniors, seniors. So I guess, even if you're finding geography late, like, a minor, or we also have applicants for grad school who are concerned that they haven't had it as an undergrad. And I feel like, it's open enough that you can enter it from
that's an interesting thought, and I'll elaborate just for a moment, because it seems to me that undergraduate geography majors are among the happiest undergraduate majors of any field. They seem to be delighted in being able to pursue this very broad field, as you mentioned, but one that interweaves the natural environment and society, and one where they're able to make a difference for humanity.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think for many students also the hands-on nature of many of the classes is also very attractive. Yeah.
Well, Emily, we're out of time. I really want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a delightful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really had fun. Thanks.
Now, this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.